Back in December of last year, I really promised myself that 2024 was going to be the year where I read hundreds of pages every single day and read so many books by the end of the year, and it's going to be my year when it comes to reading. Spoiler alert, that was not the case. In January, February, and March of this year combined, I read a grand total of 8 books. And for context, in the first 3 months of 2023, I read a grand total of 23. Since early January, I've just been in a sort of lull when it comes to reading. And I'm not mad at myself. I'm just sort of frustrated about it, you know? Like, I just want to be able to read like a book a week like I used to. But, you know, it's fine. I don't beat myself up over it. But, you know, there are worse things that could happen, so I might as well share with you all of the books I've read so far in 2024. I wanted to start this year off with a book I knew I would love, so I picked The Princess Bride by William Goldman. As you can see, I've got this very fancy special edition. Like so many people, I've adored the movie with Robin Wright and Cary Elwes since I was a little kid, and in my opinion, the book is honestly even better. If you're somehow unfamiliar with the story, it takes place in the fictional European country of Florin, and follows our main character, a farmer's daughter named Buttercup, who is engaged to a prince she doesn't love. However, before the wedding can take place, she is kidnapped and silly hijinks ensue. One thing fans of the movie might not be aware of is that the book is actually a very clever piece of metafiction told through a framing device about a fictionalized version of the author, Bill Goldman, and essentially this fictional version of him wanted to abridge a classic novel called The Princess Bride from like centuries ago, and it's very tongue-in-cheek and funny in that way. So in the first chapter, we're not actually following Buttercup and Wesley and all those people, we're actually following fictional Bill and his fictional wife and his fictional son, and just the backstory of how he decided to personally take on the task of abridging this in-world fictional fantasy novel, and it's very funny. I like it a lot. Also, it mentions how in real life William Goldman wrote the script for The Stepford Wives, which is one of my favorite 70s movies, which I thought was just a neat little thing to throw in there. William Goldman was a screenwriter in addition to a novelist, so he actually wrote the script for the Princess Bride movie himself, which is why it stays so true to the book. It's a very beat-for-beat adaptation. However, there are still a handful of differences between the movie and book. The book is a lot more fleshed out, and all its characters get their own intricate backstories, which are really fun to read about. And of course, The Princess Bride is a fantasy novel, and a romance novel, and an adventure novel, but at its core, above all else, it's a comedy novel, or comedic novel, I should say, and I think it really, really shines best in that regard. The comedy is just top-notch, in my opinion. And some editions of the book, including the one I own up there, even include a bonus chapter that was written like years later called Buttercup's Baby, and that was really fun to read as well. I would highly recommend, if you're a fan of The Princess Bride and you've read the whole book but you haven't read Buttercup's Baby, seeking it out somewhere. I'm sure you could find it at a library or something. I've never really been one to give star ratings to books, mostly because I'm so indecisive, but I might as well start this year. I would give The Princess Bride by William Goldman 5 out of 5 stars. The second book I read this past January was The Vulnerables by Sigrid Nunez. This is a literary fiction novel that takes place over the course of the pandemic that occurred in 2020. And I have to say, I'm not normally a fan of fiction that feels super modern, but I actually enjoyed this one. Essentially, it's about this woman who pet sits for her friend's pet parrot over the pandemic. And like many lit fics, it's not super heavy on plot. It's more just like vibes, you know? I liked it. 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Tao Te Ching. This is a wickedly old work of philosophy/religious text, and it's also incredibly short and easy to read, so if you're looking to get more into ancient religious texts, I'd recommend this one because it will not take too much time to finish. It was originally written in Chinese, of course, and I can't remember the specific translation that I read, but I'll put up the translator's name on the screen right now because I know the text definitely varies from translation to translation. The next book I read was The Stranger by Albert Camus, or Albert Camus. Totally nailed that right, guys. This book follows a French man whose name escapes me at the moment, but he is essentially completely indifferent and lacking in emotion in regards to virtually everything. The book starts off with him being invited to his mother's funeral, and I can't really say much more without spoiling it, so that's all I'll say. I will say, however, that this cover is absolutely hysterical. I believe this edition of the book came out in the 60s, so, you know, like very psychedelic photography vibes. And just for the record, this cover photo has absolutely nothing to do with the book. I really am not sure what the publishers were thinking. I'm not gonna lie to you, I went into this book with very high expectations, and I have to say I was ever so slightly let down. It wasn't a boring read per se, but it wasn't particularly interesting either. And I know that it's like not supposed to be interesting, but like, that didn't make me any more interested, you know? In typical Albert Camus fashion, it places a lot of emphasis on absurdism, the philosophy, not the movie genre. And I did enjoy that aspect. The last chapter was definitely my favorite, and I also watched a bunch of video essays about the philosophy of the stranger, which was interesting as well. But overall, I didn't love it and I didn't hate it. 3 stars. The next book I read was Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. I know this book looks long and intimidating, but it's actually an anthology, so in reality I only read that much. I know this play is a staple in popular culture, She's All That, My Fair Lady, that one episode of King of the Hill, but I actually wasn't at all familiar with the story for the longest time. Loosely based on the Greek myth of the same name, Pygmalion follows an English linguist named Henry Higgins, who takes in a young flower girl named Eliza Doolittle and teaches her how to improve her diction and become essentially a prim and proper member of upper-class society. I actually enjoyed this play far more than I anticipated. I adore Eliza, I adore My Fair Lady, 4 stars. The first book I read in March was Furthermore by Tahereh Mafi. The only book of Tahereh's I had read previously was Shatter Me, and while that was undoubtedly entertaining, I didn't particularly care for the plot, or the writing, or the characters. However, I couldn't help feeling, as I was reading it, that Tahereh Mafi's writing and storytelling definitely had potential to be something I would enjoy. And boy oh boy did Furthermore prove that. I adored this book. This is a middle grade fantasy about 12-year-old Alice and her search into the land of Furthermore to find her missing father. It was such a whimsical and fun read. It sort of reminded me of a modern rendition of Alice in Wonderland, or The Wizard of Oz, or The Phantom Tollbooth. The atmosphere and all the characters were just so much fun to read about, although I will say my one and only complaint with this book would probably have to do with the world building. I know this might come off as sort of an asinine complaint, because the world itself is very surreal and whimsy, but I do still feel like the world building could have been fleshed out just the slightest bit more. That said, that's a very minor complaint. I adored this one, 4.5 stars. The next book I read was Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I actually watched the Amazon TV adaptation all the way back the day it came out, and I was a big fan of that when I was, 10 or 11? So I'm really happy I finally got around to reading the source material all these years later. The premise itself is very convoluted and thus a little bit hard to just summarize in a few sentences, but essentially it's a fantasy comedy that focuses on biblical mythology and follows a cast of characters leading up to Armageddon. I really adored this book. I found it hilarious and so smartly crafted, and a definite 5 out of 5 stars. The final book I read in March was Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. This is a Sleeping Beauty retelling about a young fairy named Toadling. I've been a huge fan of fairy mythology and fairy tale retellings for my entire life, and this book includes both of those, but for some reason something about it just didn't really click with me. It wasn't a bad book, I just personally don't find anything about it super memorable. I'd say 3 out of 5 stars. It was fine. The first book I completed in April was The Wild Party by Joseph Moncure March. This is actually a novella-length poem from 1926 about a vaudeville dancer named Queenie and a clown named Burrs, and the wild, wild party that they decide to throw. This is definitely a cult classic for a reason. I loved the story and the atmosphere, and above all else, the lyricism. And as you may or may not know, The Wild Party actually has not 1, but 2 different musical adaptations. I'm a big fan of musicals, in case you didn't know. I hang my head in shame to tell you I haven't yet listened to the Lacusa musical, but I love the Lippa one. My favorite songs are probably Queenie Was a Blonde, Out of the Blue, Let's Raise the Roof, An Old-Fashioned Love Story, and Let Me Drown. And I'll definitely be listening to the Lacusa musical soon. It's high priority on my very long list of musicals to check out. The next book I read was Mostly Harmless by Douglas Adams. This is book 5 in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, one of my favorite series back in middle school. I remember positively loving the original trilogy and detesting book 4, so I went into Mostly Harmless with pretty low expectations, but I have to say I actually really liked it. I know it's not by any means a popular opinion, but I think that I was just so happy to be back in the world of Hitchhikers that I wasn't too concerned with plot structure or character development or anything like that. I was just glad to be back inside a book series I treasure so dearly. Although I've gotta say, one thing I did not appreciate at all about Mostly Harmless was its very infamous ending. It just felt like a mean-spirited joke above all else, and I don't think it really helps that it's the final book in the series, so that's all we get. So in conclusion, is it my favorite Douglas Adams book? Not by a long shot. Do I get the criticism? Yeah, I do. But did I still really enjoy it and have a good time? Yeah, 4 out of 5 stars. And that brings us to the book I'm currently reading, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. You probably already have some idea as to what this book is about, but essentially it follows a man named Nick living in New York City in the 1920s, and his very wealthy, eccentric neighbor named Jay Gatsby. I'm currently on chapter 5, and there are only 9 chapters total, so hopefully I'll have it finished by tomorrow. It's not a new favorite or anything, but I'm definitely enjoying it so far. I know I'm not done with it yet, but I feel pretty confident saying that once I do finish this book, it'll get a 4 out of 5 stars. And that's all I've got, no more. I know I haven't really read a ton this year, and I have sort of beat myself up over that just a little bit, but I don't think that's good or healthy to try to hold yourself to like impossibly high standards, especially when it comes to something that's supposed to be a fun hobby like reading. So I really try to go easy on myself and just, read what I want to when I want to. Although I really hope I get around to reading more consistently soon. I'm definitely in a bit of a slump right now. And if that does happen, I'm sure it will give me plenty of videos to procrastinate filming. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.